Retired South African Major General Otto Schur shares stories from his distinguished career at the Belmont Return and Services League Club. This covers 1968 to 2008, including being shot down over Angola in 1979.
I'd like to welcome Brigadier General Otto Schur to our meeting this evening. Welcome. General, as you can see, there's been a lot of interest in the meeting this evening and this talk. Many folks here outside of Samboa attending. And I guess the one thing that we sort of pride ourselves on as Samboa in Western Australia is secretly we probably have the biggest group of ex-South African Air Force pilots in this region.
Good evening, everybody. It's amazing to see a turnout of this magnitude, and it's unbelievable to have met people I served with in the Air Force in numbers this evening. And it's really a wonderful experience to stand there before you and to have the honor to just have a talk about my career. The last photograph was me sort of getting to the end of my flying training at CFS Reconnaissance. I actually started flying while I was in Mach, literally on the 1st of January in 1967. I couldn't have a driver's license, so my mom had to take me to Wollongong Airport, where I started flying on a Piper Cup. It had no radios, so I still used the eldest lamp signals, green to go, flashing green to go quickly, red and flashing red, get off the runway. And I went solo on my birthday, on the 20th of January, 1967, and I got my PPL license on the 31st of March of that year. So in my matric year, I was very fortunate to build up about 100 hours, so that by the time I went to the Air Force at the beginning of '68, I had a little bit of a jump on at least the fellow students who didn't have any flying experience. And it's the one thing that I think all of you who have flown, you cannot exchange airtime for anything. It doesn't matter in which aeroplane, whether it be a glider, whether it be a microlight. Once you've got that air experience, it just gives you a different orientation and the ability to absorb information a lot more quickly than those who have to start literally from the very bottom. Anyway, so at Anata, I was the last person to be drawn into being an instructor directly from my pupil pilots course. I had a very short stint at 8 Squadron where I saw my fellow students waiting for our wings parade, go through the drills of single engine operation on a Dakota, and then on the 1st of January 1970, I was back at Anata to start a stint of 5 years as a flying instructor there. Interestingly enough, in that period, because I had a commercial pilot at that time, I was able to do flying with our air commander units. It's like reserve pilots that were drawn in, that were positioned all over South Africa, and they did liaison work, a lot of that for the Army, and they did their annual training. And because I had my commercial license, I was asked to do a Cessna 185 conversion quickly, and then I had one of these 185s as my personal taxi, and we went down to the south coast, down to George and Knysna for 2 months. But more interesting than that, in 1974, around about September, very close to the end of my tour at Canada, I actually joined one SWAR squadron at Ondamwa, where they had one of their training camps. And I remember vividly, one of the flights was in a Cessna 150, and we did a border patrol from Ondamwa due north until we got to the cut line, and then all the way down the Ruakana River down to the Hooper Falls and back. And the task at that time was to count how many cases of Eka beer were being smuggled over the border. And that was, as I said, 1974. Literally 6 months later, the war in Angola between us and the forces that were against us retaining control over Southwest Africa, according to the United Nations mandate that we had. But we will come to that a little bit later. My flying tour on jet started at Longabon in 1975. I flew roughly 600 hours on the Impala or MD326. I think you have one of the variants here that your Air Force used. I hated the single-seater. It had the most terrible handling qualities. It had ailerons that were hydraulically assisted, but the elevator had a worn balance. So on one of the weapon sorties at our Roodeval bombing range, one of the pupils pulled 13G because he thought he was going to hit the ground. So it was just a complete mismatch. So in November of 1975, I was so happy to be posted to 4 Squadron. And on 1 January 1975, I started my Mirage conversion. At the time, none of the aircraft that we had looked similar. Our flight simulator and one of my simulator instructors and maintenance personnel is White Bear. The simulator didn't look like anything of the aircraft that we had. It just had a completely different cockpit layout. So when we then got into our first dual sortie, we had literally 6 hours in which to go solo. If you didn't make it, you were off the course. So as I said, I had 600 hours. My fellow students had flown Vampires, Sabres, and hundreds of Impala hours. So it was an absolute eye-opener. The first flight I will never forget. It's in a cockpit that is literally this big. The Impala was like a bathtub. It was like this. So all of a sudden, here you were in this tiny little aeroplane, the instructor at the back, Malcolm Browning, who was very nervous and jittery, and off I went in afterburner. And the first thing that really struck me, because in the simulator you can't really have any feel for relative speed, but the Impala's takeoff speed is 90 knots. The Mirage instrument that indicates airspeed starts moving at 110, just as a reference. So at 190 knots, I got airborne, did some upper air work, came back into the circuit, and by then I had a pretty comfortable feel of the aircraft and did the first landing very nicely. Malcolm Browning obviously did his nut at the back. You're going to scrape the tail. You're flying too long. Anyway, we looked afterwards. The aircraft was in perfect condition. But after 6 hours, as I said, I went solo. And that started a Mirage career that ended up at number 2 Squadron initially, where I met Steve at Waterkloof. We flew for about 6 months because we left towards the end of 1975, I think. Myself and Paddy Bate and Alf Wild were the new joinees that arrived there. And about a year later, we moved to Hoedspruit. In that period, we had to go and take senior generals and so on to Hoedspruit. The runway was already clear, but they were building revetments and maintenance facilities, so we went in and out there quite regularly. And then one afternoon, Eric Schmullen and myself were flying back in a formation, and there was a thunderstorm, and we were climbing and climbing at about 40,000. I said to Eric, well, that's it, let's level off here. Called Waterkloof radar and said, okay, this is where we are, we're heading in. And literally about 5 minutes before the descent, we came out of the angle of the thunderstorm. So Eric was extremely upset because 50 foot up or down, there was no cloud. Anyway, so that was the one thing. The other very interesting thing about being at Hoedspruit was that on the 1st of October 1977, by then I'd moved in with one of my mates. We were the only two single pilots, so we stayed in a tent somewhere on the base. And all the married people had lovely houses, and they lived happily. We had to commute to work on a little scrambler and dodge the wild animals. There was a game reserve around the outer part of the airfield. But the Friday before the 1st of October, we got a call at 3 o'clock, just before 3 in the afternoon, to say, listen, the Recce flight has to deploy to Angola. There's some urgent tasks that need to be done. So please reconfigure your R2Zs, which was the really fancy Mirage 3, because it had the engine that the F1 came out with. But having just moved in, there was a specific tank spanner that the technicians didn't have. So there was a bright afternoon. Fortunately, I had a Coke, so I hopped into the Mirage R2Z. And from Breakshof to touchdown at Waterkloof, it took me 10 minutes. It's 176 nautical miles direct. By car, it takes about 6 hours roughly to commute between Pretoria and Hoedspruit. Anyway, so I got the spanner, they refueled quickly, and I was back at Hoedspruit around 4 o'clock. Heading back, I got to 30,000 foot overhead, Cullinan, which is 18 miles from the airbase at 30,000 feet. I went to Mach 2.2, and I maintained that airspeed until just before Leidenburg, and then I had to stop this beast because the airfield was right here. And I landed 9.5 minutes later. So that's an interesting record. I think that will stand forever. But anyway, so that afternoon, I got into my Volkswagen and I went back to Pretoria for the weekend and then came back. And then on the Monday morning, off we went to Angola. We were supposed to deploy for 3 days. So everything that we had were little plastic bags in the equipment bay behind the cockpit. And interestingly enough, I stayed there until just before Christmas. We had 3 engine changes. There were more tasks that came out, and because I was the single pilot, I had to stay behind and did the last bit. So on the 23rd of December, I eventually got home and had a nice break. So for those of you who've ever been to Angola, don't go there again. It's a terrible place. Okay, so that was the sort of time period. In this phase of being at number 2 squadron, we were up on the border quite regularly. That October month, the F1s for the first time joined us at Angola around mid-October. And one of the first tasks was we obviously had to now go and reconnaissance and take photographs of all the river crossings between Manong on the sort of eastern borders of where we knew that there was some mix and they had to have resupplies through the Bongo and then all the way to Mozambique. In that phase of the F1s joining, there was bad weather for days on end, and this reconnaissance was needed quite urgently for tactical planning. And so we took off. There was no satellite cover at that stage, so you only knew what the weather was like once you got airborne and went across the cut line. So after about the 5th day, all of a sudden, no clouds. So off we went, and my escort was Pierre Duke and the OC of number 3 squadron, Fred de Toy. Anyway, so we headed off to one of the crossings very close to Manong, and then all along the railway line all the way to the west, and there was a dam called Matala where we then had to take, there was a big dam with a railway and road crossing over it, and that was the last target of that run. So to do that properly, I did a very hard turn to the right and then reversed left, and then as I rolled out, the cameras were on, and in that turn, our radar at Angola, this was literally 200 nautical miles north of the borderline, and that was at the very end of our radar coverage. And in that, they picked up two, must have been MiG-21s, that had been scrambled and were attempting to intercept us. So obviously when we heard that, I opened up my afterburner. The two F1 guys looked around to see where the MiGs could be, but they were thrown because of the high G turn that we did. And in looking forward, I was missing. In literally 30 seconds, I cleared those 374-gallon tanks to Mach 1.2 and headed home, and I was back basically debriefing when the F1s eventually arrived back. Anyway, so that was one of the interesting flights. And then, as you saw then, in 1979, that morning when I went off, I had a reconnaissance that had to be done north of Mosamades. So I went, I was on my own because at that stage, Moshe Heister said, recce pilots don't need any escort, so off you go. My S&R was the SAS Maria van Riebeeck, which was a submarine off the Mosamades coast. So if anything had happened, they had recce's on board, and they would have then come to hopefully come and fetch me if anything serious would have happened in that western segment. Anyway, I did my photo flight, then came back to the base, and then that afternoon there was this big strike. There were about 30 Impalas airborne attacking in pairs further to the east, and then there was a 16 flight formation of F1s that were going to attack military targets in Angola. And while I was taxiing out, I had only half fuel in my big fuel tanks because it was going to be a relatively short flight. But while taxiing out from that morning, there were obviously helicopter admin areas and recce's that were on standby for the early morning flights. And I saw the parabats running off and the helicopter guys going off to their Lapa. And I still thought to myself, if anything had to happen on this flight, somebody's going to be in trouble. Anyway, off I went, and as you saw, 190 knots on the radar, 190 foot on the radar altimeter, and 600 knots doesn't guarantee you safety. It was like one of my 30mm rounds going off in the aircraft, just a goof. And then everything was dead. Now, usually a Mirage has got a battery, it's got emergency power supplies, the alternators, generators, but there was just nothing. So I knew that here comes trouble. I left my power setting where it was, went through the target about 1 or 2 minutes further, and then started a gentle climb back to what I hoped was going to take me back to the Nondongwe area. And as I leveled off, I just touched the throttle and the engine ceased. And that ended up, there was no hydraulics anymore. So the aircraft just entered the spiral and off I went. I tried to pull the bottom handle, couldn't do it in a 4.5 G spiral. So eventually I got one of mine up and the top handle went off. And the next thing I knew, I was in the parachute with the wreck still flying down to the ground with a big yellow-orange flame behind the cockpit coming out. So I landed just a little bit from where the aircraft hit the ground. Fortunately, I had no serious injuries. Usually when you eject with that kind of ejection seat, you usually get compound fractures of your back, your neck, whatever, broken legs. It had a tiny parachute. It wasn't like the recce's and the parabats. They at least had 28 to 32 foot parachutes. On our early Mirages, we had a tiny parachute of just 24 foot. So you're told how to get your legs together, bend your knees, prepare for the landing. That didn't work. I had a lovely cut under my chin, but fortunately that was the only damage that I suffered. But everything that I had on my pistol, my survival knife, everything was ripped off in the ejection. And I knew that staying there wouldn't be very clever because we really made the people quite angry, very close to us. So I decided to do some escape and evasion. And then when I started hearing some some cows. I knew there would be little boys running around taking care of the cows. I decided this is the time to now maybe just buy myself. But having seen what happened on the ground at Angola, I said, if I'm lucky, the first reaction is going to be an hour, more or less. And lo and behold, after an hour, I got my an emergency beacon, and the first thing I heard was one of my classmates, Otto Schur, calling my name, and or rather my flight call sign Snoopy, and I heard that it was him, and I responded and I said, "Hi, this is Otto," which was the code to say I'm okay. And I kept to either my surname or Snoopy. They would know that it was I had been captured. So that started the S&R process. So the guys had to get the helicopters briefed again, got the bats on board, and off they went. And as you said, Paula Kruger, Ralph Platter was the other guy, and Jimmy Sales were the aircraft that picked me up. Other crew I never saw, so I don't know who was on that helicopter. But it was the longest time of my life, because the guys were pretty upset. When they hadn't heard of me, my ETA had lapsed, so the guy said there was nothing, I didn't make a call, so I must have flown into the ground. So that was it. There was no S&R. So, in fact, Trevor said not a chance. And Nick Quistation actually said that I saw a fairly large explosion more or less in that area. So Nelly got into his Impala, no weapons or anything, he just took off and headed north. And he then did mock attacks to get the guys off those. You could hear the trucks coming on and the guys shouting and screaming. And then about half an hour later, Piet van Zyl and Nick Quistation arrived with armed Impalas, and they then kept the guys at bay until we were out of there and heading south. And then, as the citation mentioned, when I got back, obviously the first thing you had to do is you had to be debriefed. So the intelligence office, and I don't know how many intelligence personnel there are in the room here. I hope not many. One right at the back. But the guy then said, "Oh, we actually heard that there were going to be radar-guided anti-aircraft systems deployed at Mopanda, but we didn't want to tell you because we thought you'd be scared." You can just imagine what my reaction was. Okay, so that was more or less that escapade. From there, after 2 Squadron, I was sent to 85 Combat Flying School as an Impala instructor. That lasted literally 6 months. And I was then appointed the flight commander of the Mirage flight at the time. And there we had some more OPSAN people coming through. We had 2 guys from Chile that actually joined us as well for a conversion. Nebaldo Forquera and other guy, can't remember. Anyway, so we had a lovely mix of people there, and then around 1985 we were told that we had to now prepare for our conversion to the Cheetah program, and that resulted in us having to present 3 courses in the space of a year, where usually it took us 2 courses to complete in a year. So it was an incredibly hectic time. That photograph you saw of the people sitting around the Mirage, that was one of the last photographs that were taken just towards the end of that phase, end of 1985. And then I had the good fortune being the OC of the designated Cheetah unit, 89 Combat Flying School, to then visit Israel to do some flights on the prototype that was in Israel at the time. And it was a very interesting experience, to say not much more about that, except that it's a completely different aeroplane. The engine and the airframe were similar, but they added the canards, which changed the handling qualities quite a bit. But all their flight manuals, we were used to French manuals that had been written in the English language, so you could really understand them, and they were excellent. But here I was confronted with manuals that had been written in Hebrew and converted into English by somebody who had no idea of aviation language whatsoever. So I literally had to rewrite those manuals in the 3 weeks before I started flying. Anyway, that was just an interesting phase to see, for instance, going down to the Dead Sea to see an altimeter going into the red, which I've never seen before. And that was about the most exciting thing. Except that on flying home in an SAA aircraft, this was the 23rd of December, so overnight it became the 24th. There was nothing on board. Then the captain said, "Oh, Merry Christmas." And that was it. So there was no Christmas for me. I'd lost a year literally. My wife and that stage, Otto was around, but it was such an anticlimax. Anyway, so that introduced the new era in Mirage training, in that all of a sudden you could now fly the Mirage down to 0 knots and recover from that, pushing forward, or you could use rudder from 100 knots and do a literal stall turn, and off you went again. The handling qualities just changed completely, which was really very, very nice to operate. The introduction to air refueling that you asked about. For your whole flying career, you're told, do not fly into anything. Do not touch anything with your aeroplane. And all of a sudden, here it was. You had to go and formate on a basket, hit it with your probe, push it in about 2 meters, not 10, because then you will rip off the hose. And then you had to hold station for as long as it took for you to take on the fuel that you required. Now, for anybody to think, oh, it's not a big problem, but the size of the basket is this. And what is interesting about the dual aircraft, on the single that you saw all the photographs, except that one with the dual actually tanking, they had their probe in front of them. On the dual, to get to the fuel tanks behind the rear cockpit, the probe was here. So it wasn't in your field of view at all. So it was a picnic, but it was a fantastic experience to all of a sudden add that as a new dimension to our training, because on the F1AZ, they already had air refueling as well as on the Buccaneer. And we were now able to teach the pilots that were destined to go to 1 and 24 Squadron to actually do air refueling before they got to the advanced aircraft. And the impact of that was on the Buccaneer conversions, where Brian Daniel, you saw him on the old Mirage course. He was paired with Giel van der Berg, who eventually became the OC of 60 Squadron. But Giel van der Berg and Brian Daniels arriving at, first of all at 24 Squadron, the usual conversion to get a guy fully operational on a Buccaneer was 2 years. These two guys were fully operational in 6 months. That was the impact of having a paid training towards the end of the course. Okay, so that's about that for the flying side. After my flying career at 89, I did a staff course for a year, and then we were selected to go to Switzerland, Sasha, myself, and the kids. By then, there was Stephen, who's not here with us tonight. Him and his family are back home, unfortunately. We were then sent to Switzerland for 3.5 years as defense attachés. That was quite a lovely time, because there I met all sorts of opportunities. We were allowed in 1990 towards the beginning and then through the 90s to make contact with German industry, with Austrian industry, eventually towards the end also had a link with Hungary. But it was really a wonderful time to be at the front end. We got our industry involved with the Swiss Armed Forces to introduce them to South African initiatives. One of the successes that I had a hand in was the fact that the Air Force chief at the time, Corps Commandant Karel, his daughter was in the UN, and they had an absolute hatred for South Africa. So while I was in Switzerland, I was not really welcome when it came to Air Force functions and things like that. But on my return, we have a 2-yearly industry day that is arranged, and in 1975 was the first time that we really had a massive air show again, with many countries attending. One of them was in fact Corporal Karel from Switzerland, and because I had been there and could speak German, I was appointed as his escort officer. Now that I thought could be quite awkward, but in meeting him and his escort officer Sasha and myself were at the airport as they arrived. The first thing he said, I need to apologize, because what I heard of South Africa and what the realities of life are were actually two completely different things. So that opened up a completely different way of engaging with him, and I took him to the various stands at Waterkloof, and one of them was at what is the company called? Grintic Electronics. They were into radar controlled sort of countermeasures and radar warning receivers. And I knew from what the Swiss were planning is they had a large contingent of ground forces in West Africa, in the disputed area there with Morocco, and they had to now deploy helicopters into that area. So I said to him, what are the things you're going to need? Will be sand filters. So he says, what do you mean sand filters? So I said, because in Switzerland everything is either grass or tar or concrete. There's no unprepared surface that helicopters really operate from. So I actually took him there and I introduced him to Gerry Radloff, and I talked around, and 6 months later the contract was signed. So those kind of links, it was, to me it was fantastic that on arrival I was able to converse with my host in their language, and it just opened up other doors as well. Okay, coming home, last little bit, I was drawn into the Mirage engine re-engineering program. While I was in Switzerland, I had the most strangest people coming through Zurich, but I had to go and meet at the airport and escort through and coming back. But they wouldn't tell me what they were doing, because this was all very hush-hush. So on my return, I was drawn into this program, and it really revolved around taking a MiG-29 engine, the RD-33, and fitting it into a Mirage airframe. Now, everybody said it was impossible, even when rumors started flying. But I said, this can't be, because that engine is just too big. What they forgot is that South African ingenuity and the aerospace company where my son started his aviation career had actually devised a way of straightening the engine. The big thing as well on top of that was that on a MiG-29 you have these two engines sitting on the fuselage, and you had two barn doors that open so that you could work on the engine, work on the gearboxes. But on the Mirage, that space was literally the space of an Otto engine. So the engine fitted, but the gearboxes wouldn't fit, so we had to redesign the gearboxes and mount them underneath between the wheel wells. And there was an APU that had to be accommodated somewhere. So it was an incredible program. So I was on that program for a while. I had the opportunity in this phase to visit Russia twice, and had the opportunity to fly MiG-29s. The first of ones was actually the more exciting one, because the second time I knew more or less what the aircraft handled like. But the first time I arrived there, on this airbase I was flown out with a VIP Mi-8, landed on the airbase escorted by some lady who I assumed was a KGB person. And she took me to where the flight crew had to prepare. And this old gentleman who was in charge of the first of the flight gear looked at me and just shook his head. So I said, I need a G-suit and I need overalls. And he didn't have an overall that fitted me, he didn't have flying boots that fitted me. He eventually found a G-suit that I could sort of fasten around my pants, and that was it. So off I went. There was no pilot in sight at that stage, so when I got to the MiG-29, Oleg was waiting at the aircraft, and he says, I'm pilot, you fly, I fly. I said, okay. So that was the briefing, and then he said, you sit front. Anyway, so I got into the front seat, and he showed me airspeed, altimeter, and that was it. So anyway, so he says, I start. And I hit the starter button. I didn't know that there was an APU that wound up, and eventually I saw the RPM gauges winding up. He says, close cockpit. And he closed the cockpit. You taxi. I didn't know how to taxi this aeroplane because it had pneumatics. Anyway, so you touched the rudders and it sounded like a steam train. And off you went. No smooth steering, off I went, but he said, right, turn right, go straight. Anyway, so at the runway threshold, I now waited, and he says, we can fly. And he said, took the runway, stopped, and he says, open power. So open power, and then I didn't know how to get into afterburn. You have to lift it and knock it to the right. It is a very strange mechanism. So off I went in dry power, and we climbed out, and he eventually got us into the flying area that was assigned to us, and he says, you fly. So I said, okay, I'd like to do some aerobatics. He says, that good. So I looked at this lot, and I thought, okay, having flown a Mirage, I'm going to fly a typical Mirage sequence. So off I went, barrel rolls, loops, and I ended off with a roll off the top. But in the loop, I felt this aeroplane was extremely sloppy, and it was just as I moved the stick around. Anyway, so eventually I did the roll off the top, leveled off, and there it was. And he says, you fly good. So, what's this? It's a normal sort of aerobatic sequence. And then I looked at the airspeed indicator, and it was in kilometers an hour. So instead of doing a loop at 450 knots, I did it at 450 kilometers an hour. Yeah, anyway, so I was quite amazed that this guy didn't grab the stick and do something. But anyway, the aircraft was beautiful. It's an incredibly forbidding aircraft. And I must honestly say that if the Russians had been allowed to fly real combat kind of flying, we would have had serious problems. So would the Americans, so would anybody else facing that. The same with the MiG-23. Arthur Piercy, that picture that you showed with the aircraft on its nose, it was the first time that we had encountered the front sector missile, and Arthur was the unlucky person. Carlo, with the Air Force chief later on, he was in the lead aircraft, and this radar-guided missile exploded right at the back of Arthur's aircraft and literally damaged the high-pressure oil system, which controls the nozzle flaps. And with that, you lose 50% of your thrust immediately, and it also took out the brake chute at the back. So on landing, he had limited power, and he had no braking power. It only had emergency brake pressure and no drag chute. And it was at Rundu, which, and I won't say why the accident happened, but he overran the runway, and in going into a bit of a gravel pit, the ejection seat fired automatically, and he got ejected and landed on the ground, still strapped in his seat. But that opened up an interesting opportunity. It was 88-ish, sort of September, around there, I can't remember the date. For the first time, we were then really confronted with front sector threats, which we had really not prepared for. We had nothing to really counter that. The Mirage F1 CZ had Mach 530, but it was a 1960s version, so it really had no punch in it. So I had the good fortune to go back to Switzerland. Well, this was before my actual military attaché tour. And with three other pilots, Norman Bruton, Theo Nell, and I can't remember the fourth person. Anyway, we were told to then meet with the Swiss, and we really had a very interesting time with them. They had already studied, and we had interchanges because of the neutrality and ourselves, so we could discuss various things. And in a little hotel somewhere near Lucerne, I won't say the town's name, the Swiss pilot who was assigned to us said, listen, we're going to go for a walk, and I'm going to take Theo and Norman and whoever was with us for a tour of the town and Lucerne to walk on the wooden bridge. But you stay here. and he gave me the complete front sector missile assessment that they had done on the Russian aircraft. And he said, you can't photostat, but you can make notes as much as you want. So that was really the introduction of our front sector theory and the flying techniques that we then applied towards the end of the Angolan conflict. Okay, I think that would be enough. I think let's take a break, and if there are any questions, I can maybe hone in on some more detail if at all. Thank you.